A surgeon stood at the end of my hospital bed and told me, in the calm voice doctors use for the worst news, that I should start planning my life around a wheelchair. Not might. Should. He said it the way you'd tell someone bad weather was coming. I remember staring at the ceiling tile above his head, counting the little holes in it, because counting felt safer than listening. That was 4 years ago. Last month, I crossed a finish line on legs that surgeon said would never carry me again. 26.2 miles. 6 hours and 11 minutes. Slowest finisher in my age group by a wide margin. And I have never been prouder of a number in my life. It isn't a straight line between that bed and that finish line. It's not even close. There were years in the middle where I didn't believe a single word of what I'm about to tell you. I want to tell you what happened in that middle stretch anyway, because the in-between is where the actual story lies, and it's the part most people skip. I taught high school freshman PE for 11 years, and I coached cross-country for 9 of them, which meant my whole adult identity was built on something simple: showing up, lacing up, and moving. I wasn't fast. I want to be clear about that early, because people sometimes assume a coach was some kind of star athlete, and I wasn't. I was steady. I was the guy who finished races, not the guy who won them. And I'd built a quiet, contented life around that exact kind of steadiness. Claire and I had been married 6 years. We had a modest house with a mortgage we could actually afford, 2 car payments, and a habit of arguing cheerfully about whose turn it was to do the dishes. It wasn't a dramatic life. It was a good one, which I didn't fully appreciate until I understood, very suddenly, how easily a good life can be interrupted. Tony taught social studies 2 doors down from my classroom. We'd started running together my second year at the school, mostly because misery and mile repeats are both better with company, and over time it turned into something more than exercise. Saturday mornings, we'd meet in the school parking lot at 6, before either of our families were awake, and ride our bikes out along Route 9 toward the reservoir and back, 16, 18, sometimes 22 miles depending on how ambitious we were feeling that week. We talked about everything on those rides. Our marriages, our students, a kid in his class who reminded him of himself at 15, a kid in mine who reminded me of nobody, which worried me more than it should have. We talked about getting older, the way men in their late 30s start to, half joking and half not, about which parts of our bodies were starting to send us memos we didn't want to read. That spring, we signed up for a half marathon together, the kind of small local race with a finish line in a parking lot, and a medal made of cheap metal that you wear around the house for a week anyway. Tony wanted to break 2 hours. I wanted to finish without stopping to walk, which had been my actual, unglamorous goal for 3 straight years running that same race. We picked the training plan together off a running magazine, taped it to both our refrigerators, and started building our Saturday rides around it. I think about that training plan sometimes. 8 weeks, color-coded, long runs building gradually toward the finish line we'd already pictured. I still have my copy. Claire found it in a drawer 2 years ago and asked if she should throw it away. I told her no. I don't fully know why. I just knew I wasn't ready to. The Saturday of the accident was supposed to be our longest ride yet. 18 miles, an easy pace, nothing ambitious. Tony showed up with new bike gloves he was unreasonably excited about. I remember teasing him about it in the parking lot, the two of us standing there in the gray 6 a.m. light, breath visible, going through the small, ordinary ritual we'd done 40 or 50 times before. Helmets, water bottles, a glance at each other that meant ready. We pulled out of the lot and turned right onto Route 9, the way we always did, and for about 11 more minutes, everything was exactly the kind of morning it was supposed to be. I want to stay in that morning a little longer before I tell you what happened next, because for years I resented every story like this one for rushing past this part. The last good minutes, the ones nobody knows are the last good minutes while they're living them. I think it matters that you know we were happy. Genuinely, simply happy. 2 tired men on bikes, talking about nothing, with absolutely no idea what the next mile held for either of us. A pickup truck came around the bend behind us doing close to 50, driven by a 22-year-old kid reaching for a phone that had slid off the passenger seat. I didn't see any of this happen. I've had to piece it together since, from a police report, from a witness in a car behind the truck, from Claire, who heard it all secondhand and somehow had to carry it to me anyway, word by word, on a day she'd never asked for. What I know is this. The truck drifted over the white line. Tony was riding slightly ahead of me, closer to the shoulder. I was riding slightly behind and to the left, which is the only reason. And I want to say this plainly, because I've spent 4 years failing to make peace with it. The only reason I'm telling you this story instead of someone telling it about me. I woke up 9 days later. I don't mean I woke up from a nap. I mean I woke up the way people in stories wake up, except it isn't dramatic when it happens to you. It's just confusing. Fluorescent lights, a tube in my throat that made my voice come out wrong for a week. Claire's face doing something I had never seen it do before. Somewhere between relief and a grief she hadn't told me about yet, because she didn't think I could survive both pieces of news in the same hour. She told me about Tony 2 days after I woke up, once a doctor said my body could handle the conversation. I remember asking her to say it again, not because I hadn't heard her, but because some part of me was checking whether the sentence would change if she repeated it. It didn't change. Tony died at the scene. The funeral had already happened. I had missed it, unconscious in a bed 2 floors above the chapel where half our school had gathered to say goodbye to him. And I have never, in 4 years, found a way to fully forgive my own body for that timing. Claire told me later that the principal had closed the school early that day, that students who'd never had Tony in a single class still showed up in the parking lot afterward, just standing there, because nobody knew what else to do with the size of it. I wasn't there for any of it. I've had to build that whole afternoon out of other people's memories, the way you'd reconstruct a house fire from photographs taken by neighbors, never quite trusting that you've got the layout exactly right. My injuries. In the clinical language I eventually learned to recite without flinching. A vertebral fracture in my lower back with an incomplete spinal cord injury, a shattered pelvis, a femur broken in 2 places, and enough internal bleeding that the trauma team had given me, by Claire's count, about a 50% chance the first night. Nobody tells you that number at the time. You find it out later, in a hallway, from a nurse who probably shouldn't have told you but did, because she could see you needed to know what you'd actually survived. The spinal injury was the part that would define the next 4 years. Incomplete meant there was some signal still getting through, which the surgeons explained as a reason for guarded hope, the most carefully hedged phrase in the entire English language. It also meant nothing was promised. My legs were there. My legs simply weren't listening to me anymore, and nobody could say with certainty whether they ever would again. I lay in that hospital bed doing math I didn't want to do, the same kind of math, I'd imagine, that anyone does in a bed like that. How much of my life is over? How much of it is just beginning differently? And whether those 2 questions are actually the same question wearing different clothes. Nobody in that room said the word paralyzed out loud. Not yet, but I could feel it sitting in the air anyway. The way you can feel a storm before the sky actually changes color. I kept waiting for someone to use the word directly, almost wanting them to, just so I'd know exactly what I was up against instead of guessing at the shape of it in the dark. Dr. Okafor was the surgeon who finally sat down across from me, 11 days in, and gave me the conversation everyone had clearly been avoiding until they had enough information to make it final. He had the kind of voice that made you trust him even when you didn't want to hear what it was saying. He told me the spinal cord injury was incomplete, which was the good news, if you could call it that, and that recovery from an incomplete injury was genuinely unpredictable. Some patients regained significant function over months or years, some plateaued early, and there was no reliable way, this early, to know which group I'd be in. Then he said the sentence I'd later repeat in my head probably 10,000 times over the next 4 years. He said, I want you to prepare yourself and your family for the possibility that you may not walk unassisted again. Plan for a wheelchair. If you get more than that back, consider it a gift. Don't build your recovery around expecting one. I asked him directly. I remember being proud, even then, of how steady my voice came out, whether he was telling me it was impossible. He said no. He said it was unlikely, based on everything he'd seen in cases like mine, and that hope without a plan tends to leave people worse off than a plan that occasionally gets exceeded by hope. I have thought about that distinction more than almost anything else he said that week. A plan that occasionally gets exceeded by hope. It took me years to understand he wasn't trying to crush anything in me. He was trying to keep me from building a life on a foundation that might not hold, while leaving just enough room for it to surprise him. Claire didn't cry in front of me that day. She told me later she'd done all her crying in the hospital chapel an hour earlier, by herself, so that when she came back to my room, she could be the version of herself I needed, which was steady, practical, already asking the next question. What equipment would we need? What did insurance cover? Was there a support group? She had a notebook by the second week, an actual physical notebook, and she filled it with numbers and phone calls and follow-up appointments. Because somebody in that room needed to be the project manager of my survival. And grief, it turns out, doesn't excuse you from logistics. That's when the money conversation started, quietly, in the corner of an ICU room, while I was still working out how to drink water through a straw without choking. Our insurance was decent, as far as teacher insurance goes. But decent and sufficient are different words entirely when you're looking at a trauma stay that would eventually run past 2 months between the hospital and the inpatient rehab facility. There were out-of-network charges from the helicopter that airlifted me from the accident scene. $11,000, a number Claire didn't tell me for almost a year because she didn't think I could absorb it on top of everything else. There was a deductible that reset because the calendar year turned over halfway through my stay. There was the slow, sinking realization that my sick leave, generous by teacher standards, had a bottom, and we were going to find it. I didn't process most of this in real time. I was busy learning how to be a person who couldn't feel his own legs, which turned out to be a full-time occupation that left very little room for spreadsheets. Claire carried the spreadsheets. I want that said plainly, somewhere in this story, because the version of recovery people see from the outside is always the patient. It's never enough about the person standing next to the bed, doing math nobody thanks them for. So the patient gets to focus on the comparatively simpler job of trying to survive. Inpatient rehab was its own kind of education. I want to describe it accurately because most people's mental picture of physical therapy is something gentle, stretching, maybe some light exercises with a colorful resistance band. What I actually did, 6 days a week, for 3 hours a day, was closer to manual labor performed by a body that had forgotten how to cooperate with the man living inside it. The first goal wasn't walking. The first goal was sitting up in bed without help, which I had done without thinking about it every single day of my life until suddenly I couldn't, and which took me 4 days of genuine, sweating effort to manage on my own. The second goal was transferring from bed to wheelchair without someone lifting me, which took 2 more weeks. I remember the specific, humiliating frustration of needing help to get onto a toilet, of a 24-year-old physical therapy aide named Beth having to assist me with things no grown man wants assistance with, and of Beth being unfailingly kind about all of it in a way that somehow made it both easier and harder to bear. My legs, during this period, did almost nothing. I could feel pressure in patches, a strange, scrambled map of sensation, numb in some places, oversensitive in others, like static covering parts of a radio signal. My physical therapist, a quiet, relentless woman named Renee, had me try, every session, to fire a signal down to my left big toe. Just the toe. Just a twitch. 4 or 5 straight weeks. Nothing happened, and Renee never once let me see her get discouraged about it, which I later learned was its own kind of professional skill, separate from the actual physical therapy. Grief showed up in the rehab gym in ways I didn't expect. I'd be midway through an exercise, gritting through the effort, and Tony would simply appear in my head, uninvited. The way he used to talk through the burn on a hard hill repeat, and I'd have to stop and sit very still until the wave passed, because crying during a transfer exercise is its own particular kind of unsafe. The rehab staff knew about Tony. They'd handled grief before, alongside trauma, and a kind counselor named Dorothy met with me twice a week, mostly just to let me say his name out loud in a room where nobody needed me to be making progress while I said it. I missed his funeral. I want to say that again, because it sat in me like a stone the entire time I was learning to sit up in a bed. I hadn't said goodbye. I hadn't stood with his wife, Renata, or his two kids, or carried anything, literally or otherwise, on the day everyone else had carried something. 6 weeks into rehab, Renata came to visit me, on her own, without being asked, and sat next to my wheelchair for an hour saying almost nothing, which turned out to be exactly the right amount of something to say. Before she left, she told me Tony would have hated watching me feel guilty about surviving. She said it gently. She also said it like she meant it as an instruction, not just a comfort, and some version of that instruction has stayed lodged in me ever since. The financial pressure kept building quietly in the background of all of this. Claire picked up extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse, nights mostly, which meant we essentially swapped which one of us was present and exhausted at any given hour. My disability payments through the school district covered a percentage of my salary, not all of it, and percentages don't pay a full mortgage no matter how carefully you round them. We started skipping things we'd never had to think about skipping: the gym membership I obviously wasn't using, cable, a vacation we'd already half planned for that August. None of it felt dramatic in any single moment. It felt like erosion, the kind you only notice once you measure how much coastline is actually gone. I came home in a wheelchair in late June, almost 3 months after the accident, to a house Claire had spent 2 exhausting weekends modifying: a ramp built by her brother over a single Saturday, a downstairs bathroom retrofitted with grab bars, our bedroom moved from the second floor to what used to be my home office, because stairs were, for the foreseeable future, simply not part of my life anymore. I want to be honest about the months that followed, because the honest version isn't inspirational, not yet. I was depressed in a way I didn't have a name for at the time. I sat at the window a lot. I watched my own street, the same street I used to run down before dawn, and I felt something close to rage every time a neighbor jogged past without any idea how much I would have given to trade places with their tired, ordinary Tuesday. Claire and I fought that summer, more than we had in 6 years of marriage combined. Not about anything specific, usually. About whose turn it was to call the insurance company for the fourth time about the same denied claim. About a comment I made, sharper than I meant it, when she suggested I try a community pool program for adaptive exercise. About nothing, some nights. Two exhausted people finding the smallest possible reason to release pressure that had nowhere else to go. The insurance fight deserves its own mention, because nobody warns you how much of recovery happens on hold with an insurance representative reading from a script. Our claim for continued outpatient physical therapy got denied twice that summer, on the grounds that I had plateaued, a word I came to hate with a specificity I didn't know I had in me, especially since the plateau in question was largely caused by the gaps in coverage that kept interrupting consistent treatment. Claire spent entire evenings on the phone, calm and relentless, appealing, citing Dr. Okafor's notes, escalating to supervisors, while I sat in the next room unable to do anything except listen to my wife fight a war on my behalf that I was too depleted to fight myself. We came close to losing the house that August. I'm not going to dress that up. We were two missed mortgage payments from a conversation with the bank that neither of us wanted to have. We sold my truck, the one I'd had since before we were married, for $11,000 to a guy 3 towns over who didn't ask why a perfectly good vehicle was suddenly for sale, and that money, plus a small loan from Claire's parents that she negotiated without telling me until after it had already happened, kept us solvent through September. I felt, that whole summer, like I was costing my family everything and giving nothing back in return. I said that out loud to Claire exactly once, late at night, and she didn't argue with me the way people do in movies. She just said, very quietly, "You're not done yet." 3 words. I didn't believe them at the time. I wrote them down anyway, on the back of a prescription bottle label, because some part of me suspected I might need to reread them eventually, on a day when I had even less reason to believe them than I did that night. I kept that label in my wallet for years, soft and creased at the folds, long after the prescription itself had run out. I never told Claire I'd kept it. I'm not entirely sure why I never told her. Maybe because some things only work as armor if the other person doesn't know you're wearing them. The toe moved in September, on a Tuesday, during a session that had started exactly like the previous several dozen. Renee's hand on my foot, both of us watching for a signal that had refused to show up for 5 months. I felt it before I saw it. A small, electric flicker, more like a memory of movement than movement itself. Renee looked up at me, and I have rarely seen a grown professional try so hard not to overreact to something while also visibly failing to manage it. I cried in that gym for the first time since the hospital chapel I never got to visit. Not from joy exactly. It was too small a thing for joy, one toe, barely moving. It was something closer to relief that the door wasn't fully closed. Dr. Okafor had told me, all those months earlier, that hope needed a plan underneath it to be worth anything. That Tuesday, for the first time, I had something resembling evidence to build a plan on. The next 8 months were almost entirely about that single message. Keep firing the signal. Keep building the pathway. Keep showing up even on the weeks when nothing visibly changed, because Renee assured me, correctly, that nerves rebuilding pathways do not announce their own progress on any schedule a calendar can predict. I learned to stand in parallel bars in November, supported almost entirely by my arms, my legs more like passengers than participants. I learned, in January, to take a single assisted step, immediately collapsing into the waiting arms of an aide, exhausted by an effort that would have meant nothing to me 18 months earlier and meant everything to me that afternoon. I started keeping a log, the way Claire kept her insurance notebook, except mine just tracked effort. Minutes standing, steps attempted, days I wanted to quit but didn't. I have that notebook still, filled with the smallest, least photogenic victories imaginable. 11 seconds of unsupported standing for assisted steps. A Tuesday in March when I made it the length of the parallel bars without my arms doing all the work. Somewhere in that stretch, I went back to work. In a limited capacity, the district and I negotiated carefully. Classroom teaching only at first. No coaching, taught from a wheelchair at the front of a room full of 15-year-olds who were, almost without exception, kinder about it than I expected teenagers to be. A few of my former cross-country runners would stop by my classroom during their free period, not really to talk about anything specific, just to sit there, the way you sit with someone you're worried about without saying you're worried. One of them, a junior named Eli Castellano, who'd been one of my better runners before the accident, told me near the end of that school year that he'd quit the team because watching me unable to run alongside everyone had made the whole sport feel different to him. Less like something joyful and more like something that could be taken from anyone at any time. I didn't have a good answer for him that day. I told him I'd think about it. I thought about it for months. It became, without my fully realizing it at the time, one of the seeds of everything that came after. I didn't know yet what I'd eventually do with that conversation. I just knew it stuck to me the way certain ordinary sentences do, the ones that don't feel important when you hear them and turn out, months later, to have been load-bearing the entire time. I went back to coaching the following fall, 2.5 years after the accident, in a way nobody on the original coaching staff had ever had to figure out before, because nobody had needed to. I coached cross-country from a wheelchair, then eventually from a pair of forearm crutches that let me stand at practice for short stretches, directing workouts, timing intervals, watching my runners form from a stationary position, instead of running every drill alongside them the way I used to. It required learning an entirely different version of the job, and I mean that literally. I enrolled in an online certification program that fall for adaptive coaching techniques, partly because the district required updated credentials for my modified role, and partly because I genuinely didn't know how to coach distance running without being able to run myself, and I needed someone to actually teach me. I sat at our kitchen table most nights that semester, the way I imagine a lot of people do when they're rebuilding a skill at an age when most of their peers assume their learning years are behind them, working through course modules on biomechanics and gait analysis with a level of focus I hadn't applied to schoolwork since college. It humbled me in a specific way I hadn't expected. I'd spent a decade being the expert in the room, and suddenly I was the guy raising his hand with questions, getting things wrong on quizzes, rewatching lecture videos twice because the terminology hadn't clicked the first time. Claire found me at the kitchen table once at midnight, surrounded by printed diagrams of running gait cycles, and asked if this was really necessary at this point in my life. I told her it was the first thing in 2 years that had made me feel like a beginner instead of a patient, and that the difference mattered more than she probably realized. Eli Castellano rejoined the team that fall, the same kid who'd quit after watching my accident change everything he believed about the sport. He didn't say much about why he came back. I didn't push him on it. We just resumed something we'd left unfinished, him running the workouts, me calling out splits from a stationary position at the side of the track, both of us quietly aware of an unspoken arrangement neither of us had negotiated out loud, that we were, in some way, rebuilding our relationships to running at the same time, side by side, just not literally side by side anymore. Financially, things were stabilizing, slowly and unglamorously. My salary was back to full. The disability payments had ended along with the need for them, and Claire had been able to drop back to fewer night shifts. We weren't whole. The savings we'd burned through were going to take years to rebuild, and the truck I'd sold had been replaced by a much older one that needed work more often than either of us wanted. But for the first time since the accident, our monthly numbers added up without anyone gritting their teeth to make them. What hadn't stabilized was the question underneath all of it, the one I hadn't said out loud to anyone, including Claire. I could stand. I could walk short distances with crutches and slightly longer distances with a single cane on good days. I did not know, 2.5 years in, whether "this is as far as it goes" was a sentence I'd already arrived at without anyone telling me so directly. Renee never used that phrase. Dr. Okafor never used that phrase. But I was 41 years old, and I had started quietly wondering whether the rest of my recovery was going to be measured in small, permanent compromises instead of further progress. The setback came from an unglamorous source, a hip surgery to address scar tissue that had been quietly restricting my range of motion for 2 years, a procedure Dr. Okafor had recommended cautiously, warning me that recovery could go either way: meaningfully better mobility or a painful few months that bought me nothing. It went badly at first. An infection at the surgical site put me back in the hospital for 9 days that February, undid 3 months of cane walking progress, and landed me back on crutches for what felt, emotionally, like a complete collapse of everything I'd rebuilt. I hit a point that winter lower than almost any point since the original hospital bed. I remember sitting in our bathroom on a Tuesday night, looking at a cane I'd been so proud to graduate to 6 months earlier, now propped uselessly against the wall while I used crutches again, and feeling a specific, ugly thought arrive with total clarity. Maybe Dr. Okafor's original prediction had simply been delayed instead of wrong. Maybe I'd spent 3 years fighting toward a ceiling that had been there the entire time, and the recent progress had just been a long, cruel detour before landing exactly where he'd told me to expect from the beginning. I didn't say any of that to Claire for almost 2 weeks. When I finally did, late on a Sunday night, she didn't try to talk me out of the fear, which I think is the kindest thing she did for me that whole year. She just asked one question. She asked what Renee thought, factually about the infection's long-term impact on my prognosis, as opposed to what my exhausted 3 a.m. brain thought about it. I called Renee the next morning. She told me, plainly, that infections like this one were a setback, not a ceiling, and that my actual tissue and nerve recovery from the original injury hadn't reversed at all. I just lost some hard-won strength and range of motion that was, by every clinical measure she could see, recoverable with time. It took another 4 months to get back to where I'd been before the surgery. For months of relearning ground I'd already learned once, which is its own particular kind of demoralizing, like rereading the same chapter of a book you thought you'd finished. But something shifted in me during those 4 months that hadn't been there in the 3 years before it. I stopped measuring my recovery against Dr. Okafor's original prediction, the wheelchair-shaped ceiling I'd been unconsciously testing myself against the entire time, and started asking a completely different question, not how far back I could get to normal, but how far forward I was actually willing to try to go. I thought about Tony's half marathon a lot that spring, the one we trained for together and never ran. I thought about Eli, who'd needed 2.5 years to find his way back to a sport that had briefly broken his heart. I thought about the training plan still sitting in a kitchen drawer, color-coded, 8 weeks, built for a man who could run without thinking about it, which I clearly wasn't anymore, but which I was beginning to suspect might still be useful to me in some adapted form, if I was willing to rebuild it from the ground up the same way I'd rebuilt everything else. I didn't tell Claire what I was thinking yet. I just started walking a little farther each week, on the cane, then without it, timing myself on a stretch of sidewalk near our house, telling absolutely no one what the numbers meant, in case they meant nothing at all. I told Claire on a Friday night, sitting on the back porch, that I wanted to try to run a marathon, the full distance, not the half Tony and I had originally planned. I expected her to talk me out of it, gently, the way she'd talked me through every other unrealistic idea I'd floated during recovery. Instead, she sat quietly for a long moment, and then asked when I wanted to start, which was, I think, the moment I understood she'd been waiting for me to say something like this for longer than I realized. Renee was more clinical about it, which I needed. She didn't promise me anything. She told me my gait was asymmetrical in ways that would need careful, gradual loading to avoid injury, that my left leg in particular would likely never fully match my right in strength or sensation, and that marathon needed to mean something different for my body than it meant for most people attempting one. She designed a run-walk progression that started, in its first week, with intervals so short I felt almost embarrassed describing them to people. 30 seconds of an unsteady, asymmetric jog, followed by 2 minutes of walking, repeated for 20 minutes total. I want to tell you that progression went smoothly. It didn't. There were weeks I regressed for reasons Renee and I never fully identified. A flare of nerve pain, a stretch of bad sleep. Once an emotional collapse around the anniversary of the accident that cost me nearly a month of consistent training before I found my footing again, literally and otherwise. I kept the same kind of log I'd kept during the early standing days, except now it tracked minutes jogging instead of seconds standing, and I'd flip back through old pages on the hard weeks, the way you'd look at old photographs, to remind myself how far the floor had actually moved even when the ceiling felt unreachable. Eli became, unofficially, my training partner, riding a bike alongside me on a lot of those early runs the way Tony once rode beside him at a much faster pace on a different road. Renata, Tony's widow, found out about the marathon attempt almost a year into training from Claire and asked if she could be there at the finish line whenever it happened, a request that undid me more than almost anything else in the entire 4 years, because it meant she decided, somewhere along the way, that this attempt was something to witness rather than something to mourn. I registered for a marathon 18 months after that porch conversation, a mid-sized race 2 states over chosen specifically because it had a generous, unusually long course time limit, which mattered enormously to a runner whose realistic finishing pace put him close to the edge of every standard cutoff. I trained for it for 9 months, building from those 30-second jogging intervals to, eventually, 3 and 4 mile run-walk combinations. Never anything close to fast. Never anything close to what I used to run before the accident, but real, consistent, accumulating distance that my body was, against every original prediction, learning to tolerate. 3 weeks before the race, I had what Renee called a completely normal taper week meltdown. Convinced the whole plan was reckless, that I was risking real damage for a symbolic finish line, that I should defer to next year or quietly back out altogether. Claire reminded me, on that particular night, of 3 words she'd said to me on a much darker night years earlier. "You're not done yet." I hadn't believed them the first time either. I decided to believe them anyway, which I've since learned might be the entire definition of courage that actually matters. Not the absence of doubt, just a willingness to keep moving despite it. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. I think most of us are running some version of a race we were told we couldn't finish, and it helps, sometimes, to watch someone else cross their particular line. Race morning, I stood at a start corral reserved for runners who needed extra time, alongside people with their own versions of the sentence, "You'll never," whatever shape that sentence had taken in their own lives. Claire was there. Eli flew in from college specifically for the weekend. Renee couldn't make the trip, but called at 5 a.m. to remind me, one last time, to trust the pacing we'd practiced and ignore every runner who passed me in the first 3 miles, which, she promised, would be nearly all of them. The first 13 miles were almost meditative, the run-walk rhythm we drilled for 9 months clicking along exactly the way it had in training. My legs holding the asymmetric gait Renee had warned me would never fully even out, but holding it, mile after mile, further than I'd ever taken it outside a controlled session. Somewhere around mile 16, my left hip started sending the specific, familiar warning signal I'd come to recognize over 4 years of listening to a body that communicated in static instead of clear messages. I slowed the jogging intervals. I leaned harder into the walking ones. I did the math Dr. Okafor had once told me to build a plan on, instead of hope alone, and the plan said I had enough time, even at this slower pace, to make the generous cutoff, as long as I didn't stop moving entirely. Mile 20 was the lowest point, both physically and otherwise. Full body fatigue, real doubt, a brief, vivid memory of the surgeon's voice telling me to plan for a wheelchair, arriving uninvited the exact way grief used to arrive in the rehab gym years earlier. I thought about Tony for the last 6 miles almost without interruption, not as a source of pain this time, but as something closer to company, the way he used to talk through the burn on a hard hill the way nobody else ever quite matched. Renata was waiting at the finish line, exactly where she'd asked to be a year and a half earlier. So was Claire and Eli, and, unexpectedly, a small cluster of my current cross-country team who'd driven 2 states over without telling me, holding a sign with my own name misspelled on it in a way that made me laugh out loud during the single hardest mile of my entire life. I crossed the line in 6 hours and 11 minutes, dead last in my age group, and I have never in my life heard cheering that sounded the way that particular cheering sounded. Renata hugged me before Claire did, which felt correct in a way I don't think either of us planned. She didn't say anything about Tony. She didn't need to. She just held on a little longer than a normal hug requires, and I understood, standing there in a finisher's medal made of the same cheap metal as the one I never got to share a race with him, that some debts don't get repaid so much as they get honored, slowly, over years, in exactly the kind of unglamorous effort nobody photographs. Someone handed me a foil blanket. Someone else handed me water. I didn't have the strength to open myself. I sat down on the curb because there was nowhere else to sit, and I stayed there for a long time, not saying much, just letting the noise of the finish line wash over a body that had finally, after 4 years, done something nobody had promised it could. People ask me sometimes if I'm fully recovered now, and I've stopped trying to give them the simple answer they're looking for. My left leg still doesn't fully match my right. I still see Renee every few months for maintenance work neither of us expects to ever fully finish. There's a version of recovered that I will probably never reach, and a different, truer version that I reached somewhere around mile 20 of that marathon, soaked in sweat, talking to a dead friend in my head, refusing to stop moving. I coach a full roster again now, still from a cane most days, occasionally from forearm crutches on harder days, and Eli, who graduated and went on to run in college, still calls me before his big races the way I used to call nobody before mine, because I never thought I needed anyone to call. I do now. I think that might be one of the actual gifts buried inside everything that accident took from me. I needed people, finally, openly, the way I'd spent most of my life pretending I mostly didn't. I drive past the spot on Route 9 sometimes. Not often. There's a small memorial marker there for Tony, placed by his family, and I stop maybe twice a year, never on a schedule, just when it feels like the day for it. I don't have a speech I give there. I just stand for a minute, the way you stand at a grave, and then I get back in the car and keep going, which I've come to think is the only real tribute available to people like me. Not grand gestures, just the plain, continued act of going on. I don't know what sentence somebody told you that you'd never get past. A diagnosis. A failure. A year that broke something in you that doctors or bosses or your own tired voice said wouldn't come back. I'm not going to tell you it definitely will. I'm only going to tell you that unlikely and impossible are different words, and that the gap between them is exactly wide enough for a slow, unglamorous, 9-month training plan to fit through. If this one landed for you, hit follow and send it to 5 people carrying their own version of that hospital room sentence. Tell me honestly, in the comments, what part of this stayed with you. And tell me what story you want to hear next. I'm always looking for the next one, and it might be closer to your own life than you think. Whatever cane, whatever crutch, whatever quiet plan you're rebuilding your own life around right now, I hope it gets you further than anyone promised. Mine did. I'll see you tomorrow.